In 1965, 50 years after Gallipoli, a stoic New Zealand sapper named Frederick Reichardt broke his silence. He said he and three mates had watched the Norfolk Battalion advance up a ridge, but it wasn't the Turks they marched into. He said it was 6 or 8 clouds, loaf-shaped, hanging low. The men marched into one and never came out. An hour later, the cloud rose up and drifted away. Soldiers gone. Welcome back to the channel. It's an extraordinary, unsettling story. A battalion lost in battle, some say to enemy fire, others to something stranger. Today we'll look at the story, the aftermath, and the theories about what happened to the Norfolk Battalion. And if you love historical mysteries like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for new episodes every week. It was August 1915, and the Gallipoli campaign had already cost thousands of lives. At Suvla Bay, the Allied landings of the 6th of August had stalled. The British 9th Corps, under General Stopford, struggled to break through the Turkish lines in the blistering heat. 6 days later, on the 12th of August, orders were given to renew the advance inland. The 1/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, 16 officers and about 250 men, was among those tasked with pushing forward. Within their ranks was the Sandringham Company, around 40 men drawn from the royal estate at Norfolk. Gardeners, grooms, gamekeepers, dairymen, neighbours marching to war together. They were the King's men, known personally to George V, who had inspected them in training and sent them off jovially with a telegram of encouragement. At their head was Captain Frank Beck, long-serving land agent to Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. For decades he had managed the Sandringham estate. Now, at 54, he marched beside the very men he once employed. Commanding the battalion was Colonel Sir Horace Proctor Beauchamp, a seasoned veteran of Sudan and the Boer War, recalled from retirement for one last campaign. That afternoon, the 12th of August, the Norfolks were ordered forward from the slopes near Kuchek and Tafata over. Their objective was to advance through scrub and olive groves towards a ridge dotted with farm buildings in the direction of Ismail Oglu Tepe. From all accounts, the attack was disjointed and chaotic. The Norfolks pressed too far, outpacing their neighbours and their artillery support. Private John Dye glanced at the fire ahead and told Captain Beck, "I don't think we're going to be made very welcome here, sir." Beck replied, "I don't think we will." Under rifle and machine gun fire, and in the suffocating dust and blistering heat, they seemingly disappeared into the scrub. General Sir Ian Hamilton, the embattled commander, in his dispatch to Kitchener called it a very mysterious thing. He wrote, "They charged into the forest and were lost to sight or sound. Not one of them ever came back." This kind of silence was rare. Even in the mud and fire of Gallipoli, units destroyed in action usually left some trace. Prisoners taken, bodies gathered, survivors trickling back. But the Sandringham Company left nothing. No wounded, no captured, not even a rumour. His words, reprinted in the newspapers at home, gave the disappearance an air of mystery. And while the battle moved on, in Norfolk, the war suddenly became very personal. In the homes of the men who vanished, the letters had stopped. Families waited for news that never came. Some clung to hope long after official lists declared the men dead. The Lynn News printed appeals from relatives asking if anyone had seen their sons or brothers taken prisoner. In cottages around Sandringham, black armbands were put away, because to wear black felt like giving up. Queen Alexandra, the grieving widowed consort of Edward VII, mourned the loss of estate staff she had known by name. She later commissioned a memorial cross and chapel on the estate in 1920, a place of remembrance for men who had known no grave. King George V pressed for information through official channels and even asked wounded soldiers in hospitals if they'd heard anything about his men. Whole villages felt the aching absence. Some memorials would later carry 3 or 4 names from the same family, brothers side by side. The vanished battalion was not an abstract story. It was empty cottages, unfinished harvests, and households left without fathers and sons. And because the men were so closely tied to the royal household, their fate carried a symbolic weight far beyond Norfolk. The mystery lingered long after other battlefield losses faded from the headlines. 4 years later, in 1919, the war was over, but the silence remained. A graves registration unit returned to Gallipoli searching for the missing, and their report was grim and stark. We have found the 5th Norfolks. There were 180 in all. We could only identify 2, Privates Barnaby and Cotter. 2 names among hundreds. The rest lay scattered across a square mile of rough scrub, nearly a kilometre behind the Turkish lines. Some lay in the open, others around ruins of a farm. Most were too badly ravaged and decomposed to identify, tragically. But even before the graves were found, fragments of the story had already begun to surface. Not all of the Norfolks were lost that day. A few survivors lived to tell their story. One of them, Private Sidney Pooley, gave his account to the Lynn News, the local paper in King's Lynn. His words were printed after the war, when the community was still desperate to understand what had happened. His story shows his bewilderment at what had happened. I did not see anything of the missing officers after I got lost. I heard the colonel call out when we approached some huts, but I did not see him again. I did not see any wood into which the officers and men could have disappeared, and I certainly did not see them charge into one. We could only come to the conclusion that they had advanced too far and had been captured or killed. At first I thought they'd simply returned to other trenches, but later I found they had vanished. His words show the same haunting uncertainty felt across the battalion, confusion made worse by the absence of a burial detail. Like so many engagements in the Great War, the dead lay where they fell, and there was one more trace of the men. Months after the battle, local papers reported that Captain Beck's pocketbook and checkbook had been found on the battlefield and forwarded to his family at Sandringham. Small personal items, but enough to prove that even those thought to have vanished entirely had left behind some fragments of their last stand. So let's now move on to the theories about what happened. Reichardt's cloud account, told in the 1960s, became the most famous. By the 1970s, it appeared in UFO magazines and paperbacks. The vanished battalion was no longer explained by gunfire, but by abduction, by time slips, even by the battlefield itself swallowing men whole. The simplest explanation may also be its most brutal and sobering. The Norfolks simply advanced too far, became isolated and were cut down. Nearly all historians on this matter agree that this is what's happened. Some may have died in the scrub fires that were known to have swept the slopes during this period. This would have made finding their remains an almost impossible task. We also know for certain that at least 2 officers and several dozen men were taken prisoner and survived the war, but not enough to dispel the sense that a large part of the battalion had been swallowed by the battlefield. Others have argued that they were captured and killed by the Turks. In 1999, the BBC produced a drama called All the King's Men. It suggested the Sandringham men were captured and executed by the Turks. A powerful story, but Turkish records and British graves reports show no mention of such executions, which is why most historians dismiss this version as a myth. And then there are the stranger, more speculative versions, including the idea of a time slip. This theory suggests the men stepped into a moment outside of our own, caught in a fold of time itself, not destroyed, but displaced. Supporters point to other cases. In York, for example, in the 1950s, Harry Martindale claimed he'd seen a column of Roman soldiers marching through the cellar of the treasurer's house. Not shadows, but solid figures, down to their armour and weapons, striding through as if time itself had thinned. And Gallipoli itself has earned its own ghost stories. Visitors to Suvla Bay have spoken of strange silences, of figures glimpsed in the scrub, of sounds of battle echoing long after the guns fell quiet. Turkish locals speak of lanetliyer, cursed ground, where animals won't graze and crops refuse to grow. The land is said to hold its memories. So perhaps Reichardt's Clouds and Martindale's Legion belong to the same pattern, places where trauma bends the boundary, where soldiers lost in one moment can still be seen in another. So when that New Zealand sapper gave the story new life in 1965, to some his words sounded like the missing piece that explained Hamilton's mystery. To others, it was a memory told too late to be trusted. What's striking is that there's almost nothing known about Reichardt himself beyond his role as a sapper. The records of his wartime service are silent, but his testimony ensured that the legend of the vanished battalion would never truly fade. If you're interested in hearing more about Harry Martindale's story, by the way, I've included a link to my video about him at the end of this episode. It really is a fascinating story. So could Gallipoli hold a similar fracture? A battlefield where trauma and violence bent the boundary between past and present? The records tell us they fell in battle. But what if we're wrong? For Norfolk, it wasn't just a battalion that disappeared. It was neighbours, fathers and sons. Men who had once trimmed the hedges at Sandringham, milked its cows and repaired its engines. Today at Suvla Bay, rows of graves mark their silence. Most are unnamed. And in the end, later research placed the losses at around 150 dead, of whom just 17 came from Sandringham. Far fewer than the legend suggests, but enough to leave a wound that never healed. So what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read it. And don't forget to subscribe and like if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.